Hello and welcome back to online English class, AP Lit and Honors English 4 students. I hope you guys are doing well today. It is Tuesday, April 7th, and today we're going to be talking about Lecture 7, which is the final lecture of Unit 5, which discusses poetic form and structure and the ways in which poets use form and structure to develop meaning. All right, so before we get into our lecture, let's just discuss quickly the top of the week announcements. Once again, just to talk about where we've been and where we're going. Obviously, you've already turned in your reading check for chapter 19, 20, and 21. We discussed the changes that have been made to the AP English Literature exam, which primarily is the fact that the exam will now be one free response essay written in response to a prose close analysis prompt. You need to continue your work on the progress checks. This will be the last multiple choice progress check because for the next month and a half, we will be working on prose close analysis free response questions in our progress check work on AP Classroom. Okay, so I've already assigned Unit 6 progress check. Let me know if you have any problems accessing that because I kind of did it in a little different way. But basically, it's just from here on out, it's going to be a free response question. All right. You need to have completed your OTN on God's grandeur, which we finished discussing yesterday. Today, you just need to tune in and listen and engage carefully with Lecture 7. And then tomorrow, we will be reviewing for your Unit 5 test and then writing that test on Thursday and then turning it in by Friday at 3 p.m. All right, next week, we'll be starting our work on King Lear, okay, which we'll be working on over the next few weeks, which will be our last major text of the year. A little bit of drama, a little bit of Shakespeare. Okay, so in preparation for our Unit 5 test, we need to go ahead and take a quick look at your review guide. Okay, so the AP English Literature Unit 5 review guide basically articulates the fact that there are two major components or two major sections of the test. Okay, the first section is going to evaluate your understanding of the elements of poetry we've discussed throughout the unit in a series of free response questions. The second major section of the test is going to require you to write a close analysis of a piece of poetry, okay, a poetic close analysis essay. The composition skills required to write a successful essay are listed below. We'll discuss these tomorrow whenever we're talking about the rubric by which your writing is going to be graded. And all of the poetic analysis content that you need to have mastered is listed here on the back side of your review guide. This review guide is available for download on RenWeb at any time. Okay, so you can go ahead and get access to that and begin the process of making sure you've mastered all of these concepts. All right, the Honors English 4 review guide is very similar. Okay, there's going to be two major components of the Honors test as well. It's going to be a series of free response questions or short response questions, short answer questions, and then a series or one close poetic analysis essay. All right, your essay, your poem will come from one poem on this list. If you're an AP, you don't have a list of poems to prepare for, to study. You are going to write about a poem that perhaps, maybe you've never read before by a poet that perhaps you're unfamiliar with, okay? Basically, that's just going to evaluate your ability to construct a reasonable analysis on your own, okay? So what are these short answer questions going to look like? Okay, we all kind of know what the essay question will look like, but what will the short answer question look like? Well, let me just give you one example from the past exam. If I asked you to describe the form of the poem God's Grandeur, okay, you would need to understand what the word form means with respect to poetic analysis, which we're going to discuss today. Form, with respect to poetic analysis, refers to the patterns or the structure of sounds and visual shape of the poem as a whole. All right, so what is the form of God's grandeur? Well, this poem is basically formed or structured according to the conventions of what we call an Italian sonnet. That's a poem that's 14 lines long, that has a ABBA, ABBA, CDC, DCD rhyme scheme. It's divided into 8 and 6, an octave and a sestet. All right, after the set or in between the octave and the sestet, there's a volta. The octave raises a question, the sestet resolves the question. In other words, that is both the visual structure, all right, the length of the lines are 10 syllables long. It's written in loosely follows the structure of iambic pentameter. And also, we've talked about its sonic structure, its rhyme scheme, its meter or sort of lack thereof, and the ways in which the lines are structured. Okay? So that would be a sufficient answer to that question that shows me that A, you know about the poem God's Grandeur, and B, you know what it means to pay attention to poetic form. Right? What if I ask you that same question for My Papa's Waltz? What if I asked you that same question for My Life Had Stood a Loaded Gun? Okay, would you be able to answer that question effectively, describing its form? Okay. So that's what the short answer questions are going to look like. The essay questions obviously are going to resemble the kinds of prompts that we have been working on throughout the course of the unit in our OTNs. Okay? All right, so let's go ahead and jump into our content lecture for the day, and you guys can go ahead and go about your merry way after we have a short conversation about form and structure as meaning. Okay, so this shouldn't take long, but let's go ahead and unpack it and make sure you understand this content. Okay, so key idea number one. Form in poetry describes the sonic and visual structure of a poem. Okay, so form and structure, a lot of times AP prompts will use that language interchangeably. Okay, when they're talking about structure, they just mean form, how the poem is just put together. All right, both sonically and visually, how the lines look on the page. All right, and how the rhyme scheme is structured, how the meter or rhythm is structured. Those are references to the form of a poem. And form can either be closed or it can be open. All right, when we talk about closed form, that's a poem that adheres for the most part. Okay, it's not dogmatic, but it adheres for the most part to a predetermined rhyme scheme and metrical pattern. All right, so like an example of a closed form poem, "The world is too much with us late and soon." All right, that follows the conventions of an Italian sonnet. There is a predetermined metrical pattern called iambic pentameter that the poem's supposed to follow. And when it breaks it, all right, Wordsworth is breaking it intentionally to draw the reader's attention to the ways in which, in the octet, the speaker, like the poem itself, is out of tune with nature. So, in other words, the metrical pattern, the use of form, the use of this predictable structure is used to develop meaning. All right, but in the same way, an open form poem or a free verse or a vers libre poem is a kind of poem that does not have a predetermined predictable sonic and visual structure. It does not mean that open form poems don't use sonic and visual structures. They do. They just use them in varying ways. They're not predictable or predetermined. Okay? So it's kind of like the difference between these two forms of beauty that we have on the left side and the right side of the screen. On the left side, we have an example. Okay, it's just like the Swiss Alps on the left. It's just an example of organic beauty. All right, is it beautiful? Yeah. Okay. Any idiot can know that what's the picture on the thing on the left side of the screen is pretty. All right. Does it follow a sort of predetermined, predictable visual pattern? No. All right. It kind of rises and it falls organically, and part of that, those organic rises and falls are what makes it pretty. All right, but on the right, okay, we've got the Athenian Parthenon. Is the Athenian Parthenon pretty? Yes, okay. It is renowned for its architectural beauty. Is it predictable in its structure? Is it a closed form? You better hope so, especially if you're standing in the Parthenon or beneath it, okay? You better hope that it has a conventional, structured, closed pattern by which everything is held up and held together. All right, it's buildings and architecture are not exactly the time for artistic expression in open forms. All right, and poetry sort of follows one of the two of those kinds of patterns and plays with the tension in between them, as poets use closed form and then break their own rules in order to draw attention or add emphasis to or develop certain tones or moods or themes. Okay, much in the same way that an open form poem, all right, can drift into metrical, rhythmic predictability and then move away from it. All right. I am reminded of Hopkins' use of have trod, have trod, have trod. So in a poem that is closed form but uses a pretty free metrical pattern called sprung rhythm, right? Hopkins in that line goes back to the iambic rising and falling predictable pattern, even though he hasn't been following that through the course of the sonnet, in order to add emphasis to, all right, the pattern rising and falling of the ancient, medieval, and modern man, all seeking the blessed or good life. Okay? So again, just example of the ways in which poets use structure or form, both in closed ways and open ways in their poems. All right? So let's talk a little bit more about closed form poetry. All right? So we've got our Parthenon as our background here to help act as a visual metaphor of closed forms of poetry. All right? There are a number of formal patterns that are like the most prominent building blocks in Anglophone literature that you should just add to your analytical vocabulary so you can describe things a little more effectively. Okay, first, when we see a poem that is just composed of unrhymed iambic pentameter, it's called blank verse. Okay, people don't really write in blank verse anymore that much, but it was pretty popular, especially in like the Victorian era. Okay, from about Shakespeare's time, like the late 1500s and 1600s into the 1700s and 1800s, writing in blank verse was a sign that you weren't an idiot, basically. Okay, it was a sign that you were skilled and that you wrote intentionally and were capable of writing in iambic pentameter. Okay. Another example of a conventional formal pattern is the couplet. Okay, those are two lines of equal length that rhyme. All right, and they rhyme back to back with one another. If you have a really good memory, you would remember that the Canterbury Tales are all written in couplets, and they're all in iambic pentameter, which is something called a heroic couplet. All right, so the iambic pentameter rhyming in rhyme couplets are called heroic couplets. Okay, it's just a nickname for them. All right, now not all heroic couplets, or not all couplets are heroic couplets. Okay, does that make sense? Not all couplets are written in iambic pentameter. Like for instance, take note of this example of a poem written in couplets. All right, we real cool, we left school. All right, so these are parallel lines that have the same amount of syllables in each one that are set next to each other in sort of parallel juxtaposing relationships using this emphatic repetition of the word we, and then we are no longer a group because we are dead. All right, we are no longer an entity. Okay. Right. So that's an example of couplets. All right. Another sort of famous structure or formal pattern is called the tercet. All right, that's a group of 3 lines. All right, and the most famous style of tercet writing is called terza rima, which was introduced to Anglophone literature by Dante, okay, who wrote in Italian but was very famous and important in English-speaking literature. All right, great example of that is Percy Bysshe Shelley's poem "Ode to the West Wind." Okay, so these are written in tercets, which are stanzas of 3 lines long in which the first and the third rhyme, and then the second becomes the first sound of the next line. So it goes basically like A, B, C, B, C, D, C, D, E, D. Okay, so you get it, right? That's just something called terza rima. If you see that, and you want to call it terza rima and just score points for being awesome, then you can do that, okay? And then finally, the quatrain. All right, the quatrain is a group of 4 lines. They vary in length oftentimes, but it's just a way of structuring a poem into 4-line stanzas. Okay, so William Blake's famous poem "Tiger" or "The Tiger" uses this sort of quatrain structure. In which he's got these parallel couplets, right? Bright night, eye, symmetry, skies, eyes, spire, fire, right? So these balanced, juxtaposing rhymes throughout the course of the poem help sort of emphasize or develop this sort of sublimity or juxtaposing tensions in the god who is capable of making the tiger and also the lamb, okay, that sublime God that William Blake is worshiping and meditating on in this poem. Okay, so again, just these are ways of describing formal patterns or visual structures in a poem. All right. Now, sometimes the author imposes a kind of meter for themselves or imposes a kind of form or structure for themselves. Okay, so think about uh, Theodore Roth in My Papa's Waltz. He set the rules for that poem by himself. That wasn't a conventional meter that he just set it up for himself. But some fixed forms of poems, all right, or some closed forms of poems are also referred to as fixed forms or conventional forms. All right, fixed form poems use conventional standards of meter and rhyme. All right, and we won't get into like a villanelle or a sestina or something like that. But what I do want to just introduce you to is the sonnet. All right, the sonnet is kind of the king of conventional meters or fixed forms of poetry in Anglophone literature. And we've got 2 basic kinds, all right? The English sonnet and the Italian sonnet, all right? The world is too much with us late and soon. That's a great example of an Italian sonnet. God's Grandeur is a kind of modernized version of an Italian sonnet that uses sprung rhythm instead of iambic pentameter. Let Me Not the Marriage of True Minds is a great example of an English sonnet. All right, so Shakespeare was a great craftsman of the English sonnet, which would start with, all right, a quatrain, A, B, A, B, you see, and then move on to another quatrain, C, D, C, D, and then a third quatrain, E, F, E, F, and then finally a couplet, all right, a little heroic couplet at the end, G, G, okay? That would constitute the 14 lines of iambic pentameter composed of 3 quatrains and a heroic couplet at the end. All right. Italian sonnets are 14 lines of iambic pentameter composed of 2 quatrains called an octet and 2 tercets or called the sestet. Okay. Typically Abba Abba, Volta, CDE, CDE. Okay. Those are just examples of fixed form poems that you would just need to be familiar with. The sonnet. All right, we won't get into any of the other ones. You just if you study poetry in college or you want to teach English, then you can learn those. But for our purposes, in a 101 course, sonnets will do. Okay. All right, let's talk about open form just a little bit, and then we are going to be done for the day. Okay, open form poems, in contrast to closed form poems, use varying line lengths and rhyme schemes. So, do they use line length? Yes, of course. They are poems and they have lines, but they break when they want. Do they use rhyme? Yeah, if they want to, and when they want to, and how they want to. All right, but both of them use them to develop meaning, right, using ear and eye as tools, just like normal poetry would do, but it just doesn't follow a predetermined or premeditated pattern. All right, so the following poems that I'm just going to pull up and show you, they lack standard rhyme schemes. All right, they lack a discernible metrical pattern, but they use pauses. All right, both sonic, right, called a caesura, like a breath or a punctuation mark, and also line breaks, which is a little bit of a visual pause, right, that requires you to sling your eyes back to the beginning of the next line and adds emphasis to whatever word, wherever it was broken, and wherever it picks up on is just in an open form poem specifically a way of saying, hey, look at that. Okay. They also are going to use rhyme, alliteration, assonance to develop meaning, but just without pattern. Okay, so a great example of this is the poem Ancient Stairway, which is printed in your textbook. You can take a look at that. All right, so that poem breaks and repeats certain sounds, especially the CEN sound, the sen, ascending and descending, century by century. All right, and the reason why it does that, okay, is just to add emphasis, okay, to the eons, the time, the centuries that have gone by as people have rised and fallen or walked upward toward sort of transcendent heavenly knowledge and also descended away from it towards more material forms of understanding. And the poem then ends with a question. All right, how will we as human beings end? Are we going to end with some sort of triumphant spirituality? Or are we going to end once and for all separating ourselves from belief and embracing a kind of material, completely material worldview or perspective? At least that's how I read the poem. Maybe not, but I think that ultimately what the poet's structure does is add emphasis to those ideas. Right? Another great example is Psalm 23 from the Bible and also Psalm 150. All right, so the Psalms are great examples of open form poetry. That use specifically the central device that's used in the psalm. I don't know if you guys ever studied the Psalms like literarily, in addition to sort of theologically. But if you study them literarily, it's actually great because the theology just comes to life in some really awesome and beautiful ways. But if you look at like really famous psalms that are just famous for their aesthetics, like Psalm 23, I mean, it's just such a pretty psalm, right? It's just pretty words. Um, but if you look at the visual and sonic structures, right? The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. Full stop. Okay? Line ends. And then there's this parallel image that the psalmist offers explaining why, figuratively, you shouldn't want. You should want meaning like I shall not desire. I shall not want for anything. I won't be lacking in anything that I'll need. Okay, so the first line it offers what we call in poetic analysis a poetic conceit. This extended metaphor comparing the Lord to a good shepherd and me to a sheep of his flock. Okay, so the Lord is my shepherd; I shall not want. Parallel sort of expansion on that initial thought. He makes me lie down in green pastures. Okay, which is indented. Do you see the visual structure in the ESV representation of the text? Okay, this is this kind of indented, like this is why I shouldn't want. It's like a sub point, and then he expands. He makes me, or he leads me beside still waters. He restores my soul. He leads me in paths of righteousness for his name's sake. So that repeated use of he doing something and me doing something, right? Having him care for me and me being the object of his care. He's making me lie down in green pastures. He's leading me beside still waters. He's restoring my soul. He's leading me in paths of righteousness for whose sake? His name's sake, his glory, his honor. So it's for my well-being and for his glory and his honor, right? The line break there, the enjambment of that run-on line helps emphasize, right, whose name's sake, for whom this is occurring. It is for God's glory, but it's also for your good, right? And then there's a stanza break. Now, is there like a predetermined amount of lines that each stanza? No, it's just a new thought. Okay, there's a stanza break, and that new thought is then helps emphasize that even whenever I am walking through the valley of the shadow of death, again another figurative, sort of symbolic, archetypical expression of just being down in the depths of life's darkness. Okay, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. Each one of those thoughts are separated in their own line to add emphasis to each individual experience, right? I'll fear no evil. You are with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. right? Again, the whole structure of the poem, both visually and sonically, okay, is just meant to add emphasis through parallelism primarily. Parallelism is the primary literary device of the Psalms, okay, through parallelism and line breaks, okay, add emphasis to what's going on in the poem. All right, so that's just a great example of a closed form poem, Psalm 23. We could also look at Psalm 150, but I think that you understand the basic point. And the basic point is that in closed form, in open form poems, right? If I called those closed formed, I'm sorry, someone was at my door and I got distracted for a second. All right, in open forms of poetry, uh, varying line lengths, varying rhyme schemes, varying stanza lengths, and the places where the lines break are used in varying ways, but still used to communicate meaning. Okay, still used to illustrate and embody and make palpable the meaning of the poem. Okay, so a good thing for you to do when you're approaching a poem, especially one that you haven't analyzed before with me or in class, is to ask yourself, okay, how is this poem structured? How is this poem formed? All right, and how is the poet using form and structure, whether closed form or open form, in order to add emphasis to certain concepts, certain tones, and develop certain themes. Okay, hope you guys have a great day. That's all I have for you today. Tomorrow we'll be studying for our Unit 5 test. Have a great